Welcome to Idaho Fish and Game's Hook and Bulletin podcast, your weekly news roundup of hunting, fishing, trapping, and conservation stories from around the Gem State. Hosted by Fish and Game's Public Information Specialist, Connor J. Lease.
And welcome back to Idaho Fish and Game's Hook and Bulletin podcast. Hope y'all had a good week. This week we'll be talking about the challenges of urban wildlife, redband trout, and an update on the dead pigeons. But first, break out the beanies and neoprene waders. It's Christmas morning for Treasure Valley anglers. The Steelhead are coming to Boise. Approximately 250 steelhead are going to be released into the Boise River on Friday, November 22nd. The Fish and Game fish stocking trucks will be releasing fish in equal numbers at the usual locations, which include the Glenwood Bridge, Americana Bridge, below the Broadway Avenue Bridge behind Boise State, West Park Center Bridge, and Barber Park. The fish are trapped at the Hells Canyon Dam on the Snake River, then they're trucked to the Treasure Valley. Now remember, Boise River steelhead limits are 2 fish per day, 6 in possession, and 20 for the fall season. Though required in other steelhead waters, barbless hooks are not required for Boise River steelhead angling. In addition to a valid fishing license, anglers looking to fish for one of the hatchery steelhead need a steelhead permit. Permits can be purchased at any Fish and Game office or numerous vendors across the state. Fish and Game's new Steelhead e-tag is available online at gooutdoorsidaho.com. The e-tag allows you to buy a steelhead or salmon permit online and validate the permit with your smartphone when you catch a fish. Of course, you would already know that if you listened to last week's podcast all about e-tagging. All steelhead stocked in the Boise River will lack an adipose fin. That's the small fin normally found immediately behind the dorsal fin. Boise River anglers catching a rainbow trout longer than 20 inches that lacks an adipose fin should consider the fish a steelhead. Any steelhead caught by an angler not holding a steelhead permit must immediately be returned to the water. And it is illegal to target steelhead without a steelhead permit. For more information regarding the Boise River steelhead release, contact the Fish and Game Southwest Regional Office in Nampa or call 208-465-8465. Be sure to check out our website to learn more. All right, continuing with the theme of urban wildlife interactions, here's an important story with a not-so-happy ending. It's time for a pop quiz. Say a bull moose takes up residence in an upscale suburban neighborhood and Idaho Fish and Game staff gets multiple reports from homeowners. What should Fish and Game do? A, watch to see if the moose stays, how it reacts to residents and vice versa. B, educate residents on why the moose is there and what's likely to happen next. C, immobilize the moose and move it back to the wild. Or D, all the above. None of the choices are wrong, and in the recent case of a bull moose that lived for months in a Boise suburb, the answer was D. This story has a longer and shorter version because it's a case study in the complexity of managing an individual animal and people's attitudes and expectations about what Fish and Game should or should not do when a large wild animal enters their neighborhood. Here's Regional Communications Manager Brian Pearson.
Fish and Game staff and the community were both pleased with the outcome, but it was a long process, and it's fair to say there wasn't always 100% agreement with every decision we made. We can't guarantee every outcome will work out this way, but we can guarantee that we will always take into account people's safety along with the welfare of the animal, and that will always be a tricky balancing act.
Fish and Game staff routinely deals with these situations, and while this occurred near Idaho's largest city, it could and does happen everywhere in the state. The Boise moose was first reported in May, and our staff initially visited the community to evaluate the situation and worked with local community leadership to provide information to residents about living safely near moose. Staff also knocked on doors in the immediate area where the moose was located and reiterated the key points about it. Give it space, keep your pets away, and reminded them that it may move out on its own. The moose was primarily chilling in a marshy area that was not conducive for our staff to dart and relocate it. Overall, the risk to people appeared minimal. Staff continued to monitor it to see how the moose behaved, as well as folks' reaction to it. This went on for a few months, but by late summer, attitudes started to shift.
We had people let us know they loved having a moose in the neighborhood, and others who complained about it and wanted us to relocate it. That's pretty typical because after the novelty of a large animal in your neighborhood wears off, its presence becomes divisive and feelings can get pretty intense on both sides.
Wild animals may seem docile at times, but at the end of the day, they are not our pets. And there's always an element of risk when people and large animals occupy the same area. Not to be alarmist, but deer, elk, and moose have all attacked people in Idaho. It's rare, but it happens. To complicate matters, wildlife are typically temporary visitors, usually staying around residential areas for a few days, weeks, or possibly months, but eventually returning to the wild on their own. This cycle is fairly common in Idaho, where animals often winter at lower elevations near cities and towns, rural homes, and ranches. But in some cases, particularly with deer, they can settle in and become year-round residents. There are also certain times of year when deer, elk, and moose can be aggressive to people and pets, typically during fawning calving season when females are protecting their young, but also during the late summer and fall breeding season when males start rutting. Fish and Game staff knew by late summer that moose breeding season was just around the corner, and if the bull didn't leave on his own, they would probably have to relocate it. In a worst-case scenario where a person was at immediate risk of injury because the moose became aggressive, an employee would have to euthanize it on the spot. Fortunately, that didn't happen. People's tolerance and appreciation for wildlife is admirable, but quote-unquote coexisting with wild animals often leads to a well-intended but inaccurate assumption that it's a two-way agreement that animals are incapable of making. When an animal seems secure and non-threatening, people often adopt it as their neighbor without knowing the downsides of living close to wildlife. To make matters more challenging for us, urbanized wildlife often divides residents. Some folks love seeing wild animals and consider them beneficial to the neighborhood, while others resent them, and sometimes a larger problem can literally sneak in. Take, for example, the common and perfectly acceptable practice of feeding birds. Many people routinely do it, and they tend to see a predictable pattern emerge. Birds show up more frequently and often in greater numbers. Sometimes other animals will take advantage of easily accessible food, such as squirrels and other small rodents, possibly skunks and raccoons, and sometimes even bears. Then, one morning, a homeowner may wake up and find a dead bird or a pile of feathers near the bird feeder. By feeding birds and congregating natural prey, they thus attracted a predator. A similar dynamic occurs when larger animals, typically deer, take up residence near people's homes. The deer find food and feel secure, the herd increases, and predators such as mountain lions, coyotes, and bobcats are likely to find them. In the case of town deer, and sometimes elk, predators rarely keep the local population in check, so the herd grows. Eventually, they often become year-round residents that outlast their welcome when they take over people's property, eat landscaping, leave piles of droppings, create traffic hazards, and become aggressive towards people and pets. Some of Idaho's towns and cities also have resident bears that create their own set of problems by raiding garbage cans, gardens, and feeders, or attacking livestock and pets. Another common misconception is that Fish and Game can work like a reverse Amazon delivery truck that shows up, puts a large wild animal gently to sleep, and whisks it back to its natural habitat. It takes a large team and special equipment that has to be deployed each time. Fish and Game has an excellent track record of relocating animals, but it always poses risks. Brian Pearson explains the behind-the-scenes decisions involved with relocating a wild animal.
Darting and relocating any animal involves the use of potent immobilization drugs that produce significant physiological effects and carry inherent risks even in a controlled environment. The risk is not only for the animal, but also the Fish and Game staff who have to immobilize and handle the animal.
There are very real risks of an animal dying as a result of using an immobilization drug, including those associated with the drugs themselves or from situations that arise after darting, but before the immobilization drug kicks in. Biologists don't know exactly how each animal will react to being drugged, or where it might go immediately after being darted, but before the drug takes effect. An animal might run into traffic, or into water and drown, or someplace else that can harm them. Even in the best situations, darting wildlife is always stressful to the animals. When Fish and Game decides to dart and move an animal, staff takes every step to mitigate these risks. That includes protecting people and traffic by controlling public entry into an area where the animal is located. Again, it's that tricky balancing act. Fish and Game staff have decades of experience with these situations, and if they feel conflict with people is inevitable, often they will immediately move an animal despite it not posing an immediate risk to the public. While watching and waiting may be preferred by some local residents, Fish and Game biologists and conservation officers know prolonged monitoring of an individual animal can take up a disproportional amount of time and detract from their larger mission of managing whole herds and populations. Idahoans value and treasure wildlife, and that includes both populations and individuals. There are inherent conflicts when wildlife, particularly large wildlife, live close to people, and it rarely works out well for the animals. An animal visiting for a brief amount of time is one of the highlights of living in Idaho, and it's one we all enjoy and appreciate. But when temporary becomes extended or permanent, Fish and Game staff knows trouble isn't far behind. Urban deer and elk herds create a host of problems already mentioned. Bears are notorious garbage raiders who will continue to seek that food throughout their lives. Mountain lions can make pets part of their diet, and large animals create challenges for everyone, from urban homeowners to motorists to rural farmers and ranchers. That's why it's always best for wild animals to live in wild, natural habitats. Just like when we go outdoors and become temporary visitors in their homes, they should also be temporary visitors to ours. All right, moving on to Jen Vincent's story about redband trout. Cutthroat trout may be the state fish, but the redband trout is itself a state gem. Redband trout are a subspecies of rainbow trout that are native to the interior portion of western North America. In the U.S., that includes Idaho, Oregon, Washington, California, Montana, and Nevada. Redband trout are similar in appearance to rainbow trout, such as the familiar rosy pink stripe from their gills to their tail. But there are a few differences too, such as larger, more rounded spots and parr marks which persist into adulthood. Check out our May 2020 edition of the Wildlife Express magazine to learn more about redband trout. Now, the Wood River Basin in central Idaho lies on the very eastern edge of the native range of redband trout. Like many other river basins in southern Idaho, the Wood River Basin has been hydrologically isolated from the Snake River for quite a long time. Over 50,000 years ago, glaciation and volcanic activity formed the Malad Gorge Falls, an almost 60-foot tall waterfall that prevents upstream movement of fish from the Snake River into the Wood River Basin. Due to its isolation, there are several fish species that are unique to this system. The Wood River sculpin is found nowhere else in the world. The basin is also home to populations of bridgelip suckers and mountain whitefish, which are genetically unique from all other populations in Idaho. It was also recently discovered that redband trout in this basin are also genetically distinct from other redband trout populations. In 2003, Idaho Fish and Game staff set out to learn where redband trout were in the basin and found that redband trout occupied less than 20% of the more than 100 stream reaches that were surveyed. That's not unusual in arid portions of Idaho. Many streams which appear on maps aren't really streams at all. They're just dry channels which rarely have flowing waters, let alone trout populations. Despite their somewhat limited distribution, redband trout were the most widely distributed and abundant trout species in the basin. In 2021 and 22, Fish and Game staff returned to 22 stream reaches where redband trout were found in 2003. Staff found that redband trout were no longer present at 5 reaches, which were previously occupied by both redband trout and brook trout in 2003, but were now entirely comprised of brook trout. This is concerning, as non-native brook trout in western North America tend to outcompete native trout, often leading to displacement of the native fish. However, staff also found brook trout were no longer present at 2 reaches, which are now completely occupied by redband trout. This was an unexpected finding and shows that redband trout might be able to withstand brook trout displacement in some instances. At the remaining 15 stream reaches surveyed, both species were observed together. The stream reaches where redband trout and brook trout were displaced were small streams less than 5 meters wide, suggesting small streams might be the most vulnerable reaches for displacement of either species. Brown trout were also present in the basin, but were only found in low elevation main stem river sections of the Big Wood and Little Wood rivers. At this time, brown trout are not considered a concern for redband trout. Trout populations are notorious for fluctuating widely from year to year and thus must be monitored through time. More surveys will be used to assess whether the changes we recently observed continue into the future. This is why you often see our staff working in streams around the state, monitoring our fish populations. In locations like the Wood River Basin, where genetically distinct fish lineages reside, these surveys help us understand and manage such unique fish populations. If you're interested in learning more about Idaho's redband trout and need some pictures to help you visualize these little guys, head on over to our website and read Jen Vincent's blog. All right, last up, we got an update on those dead pigeons down near American Falls. Recall back in episode 35, I highlighted a story coming out of the southeast region where several pigeons were found dead. Our wildlife health and forensic laboratory has completed its test on some of the dead pigeons found in and near an unoccupied building in American Falls last month. Samples taken from the birds were negative for pigeon paramyxovirus, I'm sure I just butchered that, and avian influenza, 2 diseases of concern. The necropsy investigations support the likely cause of deaths were due to emaciation, or poor body condition. On October 25th, an Idaho Fish and Game conservation officer responded to a call regarding a multitude of pigeons that were dying or already dead in and around a large vacant building in American Falls. The officer discovered over 200 birds that were dead or having difficulty walking and flying. Several dead birds were immediately collected and submitted for disease testing. And that's all I got on dead pigeons this week. It's time for the Rapid Fire Bulletin. Hey, in case you missed it, watch the full recap of the November 7th Commission meeting in Salmon now on our YouTube channel. Topics covered include the 2025 through 2030 Fisheries Management Plan, Panhandle CWD Management Zone and deer harvest sampling, and an update from the Hunting and Technology Working Group. The Upper Snake region conducted 2 hunter check stations during the weekends of October 12th through the 13th and October 19th through 20 in 2024. Over these 2 weekends, 1,299 hunters were checked, providing over 200 CWD samples, along with meaningful harvest data and hunting condition updates. This year, biologists focused on the northwest and northeast part of the region and were unable to operate check stations in the southeastern units of 66, 67, and 69. Biologists eagerly await the information provided by mandatory hunter reports to provide a more complete picture of harvest numbers throughout the entire region. With holiday breaks on the horizon, hunter education instructors have ramped up the number of courses being offered in southwest Idaho. For parents who are aiming to get their soon-to-be hunter certified for next fall, there is no better time than the present to put your kid through hunter education, or a hunting and shooting sports skills course to help hone their skills. A total of 12 courses with open seats are slated to start in the next several months, with more to come. Hit the link below to see a full list of all upcoming courses coming to the Southwest region. Okay, that's it for this week's stories. It's time for our question of the week. All right, here's the question. Why was the non-resident deer and elk tag sale moved to December 10th? Good question. The change is intended to allow residents to conveniently buy licenses and permits in early December, ensure auto-renew transactions can be processed in a timely manner, and provide better customer service to all buyers. With December 1 falling on a Sunday this year and it being Thanksgiving weekend, we think December 10th will be more convenient for both our resident and non-resident customers. Hope this helps. That's all the news we have for this week. Thanks for putting an ear to Idaho Fish and Game's Hook and Bulletin. If there's something on your mind or if you got a question related to fish and game matters, feel free to drop us a line at podcast@idfg.idaho.gov. Again, that's podcast@idfg.idaho.gov. Thanks for listening, folks. We'll catch you next week.